What if someone was watching you right now? Not in the way paranoia whispered at 3 a.m., but in the quiet, methodical way a scientist observes an experiment. What if, in this very moment, your smallest gestures were being cataloged? Every time you helped someone, no one else noticed. Every moment you chose kindness when cruelty would have been easier, cheaper, more profitable. What if someone was keeping score of your character? Not your accomplishments, not your net worth, not the impressive titles on your resume, but the texture of who you actually were when no one important was looking. What if that invisible observer was waiting to see if your virtue matched your circumstances? If you'd remain decent when desperation whispered compromise? Most people never think about this question. Most people assume their quiet kindnesses disappear into the void, unwitnessed and unrewarded. They believe the universe doesn't notice. They believe that showing up for invisible people costs them everything and gains them nothing. But what if they were wrong? What if one woman's seemingly pointless act of service, repeated over months, performed without expectation, was actually the beginning of a test that would shatter everything she thought she knew about herself? This is a story of how kindness became currency, how one waitress discovered that she'd been observed all along, and how the greatest rewards in life come not to those who pursue them, but to those who've already surrendered to something far more powerful than ambition. Diane Murphy was 43 years old, though her reflection suggested someone 10 years further along. The fluorescent lights of Rosewood Diner had a way of draining color from skin, making everyone look equally exhausted. She'd worked there for 6 years, 6 years of 6 a.m. shifts and split doubles, 6 years of feet that ached in ways modern medicine couldn't quite fix, 6 years of watching her own potential calcify into routine. The money was a problem, though money was never quite the real problem. It was the shape the money took or didn't take. $4,800. That was a monthly cost of her mother's nursing home, the place where Margaret Murphy spent her days staring out windows and forgetting Diane's name with increasing frequency. $4,800 multiplied by 12 equaled $57,600 annually, a number that had stopped feeling like money and started feeling like a life sentence. Diane's apartment was a studio on the south side of town, the kind of place where the radiator clanked all winter and the air conditioning didn't exist as a concept. One room served as bedroom, kitchen, and office. She pushed a desk into the corner, and that's where she spent her evenings, after clocking out of Rosewood, doing data entry for a medical billing company at $12 per hour. The work was mind-numbing. The pay was insulting. And it was the difference between keeping her mother in a decent facility versus one of the state-run institutions, where residents became inventory. Collection agencies called now. 3 different ones. They called during her shifts, leaving messages on her old voicemail about accounts in default, about legal action, about the unfortunate necessity of wage garnishment. She'd learned not to listen to the whole message. The gist was always the same. You owe us money you don't have, and consequences are coming. But here's what made Diane different from the other waitresses at Rosewood. The thing that Crystal and Beth couldn't quite understand. Even with all of that pressing down on her chest, even with the weight of her mother's decline and the paperwork that multiplied like rabbits, Diane still smiled at customers. Not the thin customer service smile that could cut glass. An actual smile. The kind that came from somewhere beneath the exhaustion, some stubborn core that hadn't calcified despite everything. When Mrs. Peterson from Table 3 mentioned her grandson's school play, Diane remembered to ask about it the next week. When Mr. James ordered his coffee black but looked like he needed sweetness, she brought sugar packets without being asked. When the teenager nervously ordered for what was obviously his first date, Diane steered them to the quiet booth and made sure their water glasses never ran empty. Kindness was all Diane had left to give, and somehow, impossibly, she kept giving it anyway. Rosewood Diner existed in a pocket of Columbus that time had forgotten. The exterior was a faded forest green with a neon sign that flickered inconsistently. The S in Rosewood had been broken for 3 years. The interior was a museum of the 1970s. Red vinyl booths with duct tape seams, a long Formica counter that had been resurfaced so many times it had developed its own topography. Checkered linoleum that hadn't been replaced since before Diane was born. The floor bore the scars of thousands of dropped plates, spilled drinks, and the weight of countless rush shifts. The scent of burnt coffee mixed with something that might have been artificial vanilla syrup creating an olfactory signature that clung to Diane's clothes and hair. No amount of washing ever quite removed it. The kitchen perpetually smelled like grease that had been recycled through too many cycles, like meat that was adequate but not fresh, like the industrial compromise between nutrition and profit margin. Todd Brennan managed a place with the precision of a man who'd turned penny pinching into an art form. He was 56, had sandy hair that was graying at the temples, and wore shirts that strained slightly at the buttons. A man whose life had taken the shape his choices had carved. He moved through the diner with the energy of someone constantly calculating, constantly assessing whether anything or anyone was worth the space they occupied. He saw spilled coffee not as an accident, but as a direct assault on the day's profit margin. He saw Diane's extra kindnesses not as hospitality, but as theft, giving away the owner's resources to people unlikely to return. "We're running a business, not a charity," he'd reminded Diane more than once, his tone suggesting that compassion and profitability existed in zero-sum competition. Crystal Russo had worked at Rosewood for 4 years. She was 38 but carried the specific exhaustion of someone who'd given up on life while still being too young to accept it. Her blonde hair was maintained through expensive treatments that were becoming less effective, and her smile had hardened into something brittle and defensive. She moved through shifts with tactical efficiency, treating each table as a transaction and nothing more. She'd learned long ago that caring slowed you down and killed your tips. Beth Martinez was younger, 29, and was developing Crystal's hardness at an accelerated pace. She had 2 kids at home and no patience for anything that didn't directly translate to money. She viewed Diane's extended conversations with customers the way a soldier might view a medic stopping to comfort the wounded instead of triaging the injured. Inefficient, impractical, indulgent. Both women had warned Diane, not out of kindness, but out of the particular frustration of watching someone make choices they considered professionally self-destructive. "You're wasting your time on people who don't matter," Crystal had said one afternoon, watching Diane hand an elderly customer a piece of pie on the house because she'd mentioned her grandson loved Rosewood's recipe. "Todd's going to fire you," Beth had added. "You know that, right? One more complaint about you taking too long or giving away inventory, and you're done." The customers who came through Rosewood reflected the neighborhood. Working people mostly. People for whom a plate of eggs and toast represented a small luxury. People with weathered hands and eyes that had learned to expect disappointment. They were also overwhelmingly invisible to the wider world. They were the people who kept the city functioning while remaining utterly unremarkable in its calculations. They snapped their fingers at waitresses. They moved tables if they didn't like the booth they were seated in, as if the location mattered more than the service. They avoided eye contact, treating waitstaff as parts of the infrastructure rather than people. They were rude not out of malice, but out of the particular exhaustion of lives lived in careful, constant compromise. It was the kind of place where kindness was radical, where seeing someone truly seeing them felt like an act of defiance. She appeared on a Tuesday morning in late November, materializing through the front door like smoke taking human form. Diane didn't notice her immediately. The morning rush was building, that chaotic period between 7 a.m. and 9 a.m. when the diner filled with people grabbing breakfast before work, each demanding quick service and minimal interaction. But then Crystal's voice cut through the noise, sharp with something between disgust and dismissal. "Ugh, not today." Diane looked up from the coffee station where she was refilling carafes. The woman in booth 7 caught her attention immediately, not because she was remarkable, but because she was so thoroughly unremarkable that most people's eyes simply passed over her. She was old. Properly old, not the modern 60-something that Botox and fitness could disguise, but genuinely aged, the kind of old that came from decades of living without particular gentleness. Her hair was silver gray, thin enough that her scalp showed through in places, pulled back in a style that might have been deliberate or might have simply been convenience. She wore layers. A faded cardigan over a flowered blouse that had been sewn in a decade that had strong opinions about florals. Her pants were brown, the fabric stretched and softened by wear. Everything about her suggested someone who shopped exclusively at places that existed to dispose of other people's cast-offs. But what struck Diane most was the woman's posture. Yes, she was hunched. Age and gravity had their way with spines. But there was a particular dignity in how she carried that hunch, as if she'd made a conscious decision to carry herself with a kind of deliberate grace despite what her body had become. Her eyes were blue, faded to the color of old denim, and they moved through the diner with an unusual precision, cataloging, observing, noticing. She ordered nothing immediately. She simply sat in booth 7, a corner booth one Diane noticed she must have specifically chosen, and waited. The other customers looked at her the way one might look at an unexpected stain, acknowledgement of presence, quick calculation of inconvenience, then deliberate disregard. A businessman in booth 4 actually frowned, as if her mere existence in his vicinity diminished his experience. Todd watched her from behind the counter with the expression of someone calculating how long before he had legitimate grounds to ask her to leave. He saw her clothes, her worn appearance, her singular presence, and his internal calculus immediately classified her as a problem rather than a customer. Crystal delivered a menu with visible reluctance, slamming it down on the table with enough force to suggest hostility. She didn't wait for an order. She simply walked away, making clear through her body language that she considered this particular customer beneath standard customer service protocols. It was in that moment, watching the woman sit alone in booth 7, invisible to everyone else in the diner, subject to the particular cruelty of dismissal, that Diane saw her mother. Not in appearance, though there were similarities. She saw her mother in the way the woman carried the weight of being invisible to a world that had decided she no longer mattered. She saw her mother in that careful dignity, that determination to maintain grace despite circumstances conspiring to strip it away. Diane felt something shift inside her chest, something that had nothing to do with the morning rush and everything to do with recognition. This woman needed to be seen, not out of pity. Pity would have been patronizing, but out of the simple human recognition that everyone who walked through that door, regardless of appearance or apparent value, deserved to be treated as if they mattered. She poured a fresh cup of coffee, made sure it was the right temperature, and brought it to booth 7 without being asked. She set it down gently, making sure the cup landed softly, and added cream and sugar without asking. The woman's faded blue eyes looked up at her. For a moment, there was no expression. Now, was it gratitude? Recognition? Something passed between them that Diane couldn't quite name. The woman's thin lips curved slightly upward, the smallest approximation of a smile, and she inclined her head in a gesture that felt almost ceremonial. She didn't speak, but in that silence, something had been established. A thread had been drawn between them. The woman returned the next morning at exactly 7:47 a.m. Diane noticed the precision of it immediately because she was present for the woman's arrival, watching from the coffee station as that familiar hunched figure came through the door. 7:47, not 7:45, not 7:50, exactly 7:47. The woman took booth 7 without hesitation, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body required negotiation with space and gravity. She sat, folded her hands on the table in a gesture that seemed both patient and ancient, and waited. Diane found herself preparing the order before the woman could request it. Eggs over easy, wheat toast cut diagonally, though she didn't know yet that the diagonal cut mattered, that it would matter terribly before this was over. Coffee to exactly 2 inches from the rim, neither more nor less. Butter on the side, not melted into the toast. The meal appeared before booth 7 at 7:50, a consistency that was beginning to feel almost ritualistic. By the third day, Diane recognized what was happening. This was becoming routine, not the sterile professional routine of a waitress serving a customer, but something else, something that felt sacred. The woman arrived at 7:47. Diane had the breakfast ready by 7:50. The transaction happened in almost complete silence, with only the smallest gestures passed between them. The woman ate slowly, deliberately, savoring each bite as if it contained meaning beyond simple nutrition. She finished her coffee. She left exactly $8.47 on the table, a tip so precise it seemed calculated to communicate something more than gratitude. By week 2, Diane had begun to understand that these 7 minutes every morning were becoming the anchor that kept her tethered to something like hope. Her life outside those 7 minutes was unraveling in slow motion. Collection agencies had begun leaving more aggressive messages. Her mother had a UTI that required a hospital visit, an experience that had set her back another $3,000. Her apartment's heating system had developed a problem that required repairs the landlord showed no interest in making. At night, Diane sat at her desk doing medical billing data entry, watching the numbers on her invoices blur together, feeling the weight of a future that was already predetermined. But every morning at 7:47, that woman appeared. And for 7 minutes, Diane was part of something that mattered. The ritual required attention. It required care. It required her to slow down in a world that was grinding her into smaller and smaller pieces. She began talking to fill the silence. Small things at first. Comments about the weather, observations about the other customers, fragments of her own life that she released like smoke, not expecting them to land anywhere. But the woman listened, really listened, with the intensity of someone whose silence was a form of profound attention. My mother loved this diner, Diane mentioned one morning, setting down the coffee. Before the stroke, she'd come in here on Saturdays. She used to order the same thing every single time. The manager never remembered her order, but she'd tell him anyway, like maybe this would be the day he'd actually pay attention. The woman's shoulders shifted slightly. Was that empathy? Understanding? Diane continued. I'm trying to keep her in a good place. The nursing home. She needs care I can't provide. There was no reason to say this to a stranger, yet Diane found the words spilling out, words she'd kept locked inside for months because there was no one in her life who asked about them, who had space for them. But it's expensive, and I'm not sure I can keep doing it. The woman's thin hand reached across the table. For a moment, Diane thought she might speak, but instead, the woman simply touched the back of Diane's hand with fingertips that felt like bird bones wrapped in paper-thin skin. The gesture was small but absolute in its communication. I see you. Your struggle matters. You matter. By month 2, Crystal had begun making pointed comments. You're wasting so much time on that woman. She barely tips. And honestly, she's creepy. Something's off about her. Beth had been more direct. Todd's getting annoyed. He told me yesterday that you're spending too much time at that booth. He said it's bad for service metrics or whatever. You need to stop treating her like she's special. But Diane couldn't stop. Not because the woman was special, though she was beginning to suspect she might be, but because in showing up for her, Diane was showing up for herself. In seeing this invisible woman, Diane was reclaiming her own visibility. In an act of sustained, unrewarded kindness, Diane was proving something essential to herself, that she wasn't just a collection of bills and failures, that her capacity to care mattered even when the world insisted it didn't. By week 12, the ritual had become meditative. The coffee at precisely the right temperature. The eggs cooked to exact specifications. The toast cut at an angle that seemed almost ceremonial. Diane arrived at work on these mornings with the sense that she was moving toward something sacred, something that existed outside the ordinary machinery of the diner. The other customers barely noticed her anymore. Todd had stopped commenting, though his disapproval hung in the air like cigarette smoke. Crystal and Beth treated Diane's devotion to Booth 7 with the particular contempt reserved for people who refused to accept the world's rules about what deserved attention and what didn't. But the woman noticed. Diane could feel her noticing. The way those faded blue eyes tracked Diane's movements through the diner. The way she seemed to be cataloging not just the ritual itself, but the intention behind it. The dignity with which Diane was chosen to perform the service. She didn't know she was being observed. Didn't understand that those meticulous eyes were doing more than watching her serve breakfast. She didn't realize that in these moments of radical, unrewarded kindness, she was being tested by forces far larger than herself. Forces that had been waiting decades for someone like her to prove that character existed independent of circumstances. All Diane knew was that at 7:47 a.m., a woman she didn't know would appear. And for 7 minutes, kindness would matter. For 7 minutes, she would be exactly who she wanted to be. She didn't know that everything was about to change. The pattern solidified over time, becoming less a transaction and more a language. 3 months passed. 90 days of 7:47 a.m. arrivals, 90 breakfasts prepared with increasing precision, 90 small moments of connection that had begun to feel like the only authentic thing in Diane's deteriorating world. The woman never spoke beyond the occasional grunt of acknowledgement. But she communicated constantly through gesture and silence. Diane learned to read the subtle shifts in her posture. The way her shoulders would soften when Diane mentioned her mother's crossword puzzle obsession. She used to do them in pen. Diane had mentioned one morning, setting down the coffee. In pen, not pencil, like she was so confident in her answers that she didn't need the option to erase. The woman's faded eyes had closed for a moment, a gesture that felt almost like grief. Her thin hand had trembled slightly as she lifted the cup. There were days when Diane talked about her dead teaching dream. I was going to be a teacher, she'd said, surprising herself with the admission. 3rd grade. I had it all planned out. I was going to make sure every kid in my classroom felt seen, felt like they mattered, like their ideas were worth hearing. She'd laughed then, but there was no humor in it. Turns out life has different plans. The woman had looked at her for a long moment, and something in her expression, of particular intensity, a focus that suggested she was cataloging not just the words but the weight behind them, had made Diane feel suddenly, acutely observed. There were mornings when Diane mentioned her broken heater, how she'd taken to sleeping under 3 blankets and a winter coat, how the landlord refused to return her calls. She complained about collection agencies, about the nursing home's increasing requests for updates on her mother's care, about the grinding exhaustion of working 2 jobs and still falling further behind. And through it all, the woman listened, not with the performative sympathy people offered when they had nothing else to give, but with genuine attention, the kind of listening that made Diane feel like her struggles mattered, like someone in the universe was keeping track of her pain. The coworkers had become relentless. Crystal had taken to making pointed comments loud enough for Diane to overhear. Some people can't understand that business is business. They think they're special. They think their kindness is going to change the world. Beth had been more subtle, but her disapproval was just as crushing. A constant, low-level suggestion that Diane was making poor professional choices, that her behavior was marking her as someone to be pitied. Todd had pulled her aside one afternoon with his manager voice, the one that suggested genuine concern masking genuine indifference. Murphy, I'm going to be straight with you. You're adopting strays. That woman comes in here, she's a customer. She pays her bill, she leaves. That's the relationship. You're starting to blur lines that shouldn't be blurred. People talk, they notice, and they use it against you. But the most striking detail was the tip. Every single morning, without fail, the woman left exactly $8.47 on the table. Not $8.50, not $10, always $8.47. Diane had tried to return it once, 6 weeks into the ritual. She'd placed the bills and coins back on the table with gentle insistence. Please, she'd said, you don't need to do this. The woman's hand had shot out with surprising speed, her fingers closing around Diane's wrist with strength that seemed impossible given her apparent fragility. The grip was firm but not painful, a communication in its own right. Her faded blue eyes had locked onto Diane's, and in that moment, something passed between them that Diane couldn't articulate. Not anger, not warning, but something ancient and powerful. A message delivered through flesh and bone. This matters. You matter. Stop trying to refuse what I'm choosing to give. The woman had released her then, and Diane had stepped back, the $8.47 remaining on the table like a sacrament. Other customers had started complaining. A businessman had asked why that person was allowed to take up valuable booth space. A group of young professionals had moved tables, making theatrical comments about the clientele. Todd had watched these reactions with the careful interest of someone weighing business decisions, and there had been moments when Diane genuinely feared he'd ask the woman not to come back. But Diane continued anyway. She continued because in those 7 minutes every morning, something shifted inside her. The collection agencies, the medical bills, the slow calcification of her abandoned dreams. All of it receded. What remained was pure, the opportunity to matter to someone, to perform an act of genuine service with no expectation of reward, to prove to herself that she hadn't completely surrendered to the machinery of survival. The ritual became the only thing keeping Diane tethered to hope. It became the proof that kindness existed independent of profit margins, that seeing someone, really seeing them, was an act of rebellion in a world designed to make people invisible. The morning arrived like any other morning, except it didn't. Diane clocked in at 6:15 a.m. She prepped the coffee station, checked the eggs, made sure the toast would be ready. She waited for 7:47 a.m. with the particular anticipation that had become her normal, the way a plant waits for sunlight. 7:47 came and went. Diane told herself the woman was simply late. Perhaps she'd overslept. Perhaps she'd had an appointment. Diane prepared the breakfast anyway. Eggs over easy. Wheat toast cut at that precise angle. Coffee to exactly 2 inches from the rim. And set it warming on the kitchen counter. 7:48 arrived. Still no hunched figure pushing through the front door. 7:49. The breakfast was beginning to cool. Other customers came and went. Todd moved through the diner with his usual calculation. Crystal and Beth worked their tables, moving with the efficient brutality of people who'd learned to stop caring about individual stories. 7:50 passed. Booth 7 remained empty. By 8 a.m., Diane's concern had graduated from curiosity to genuine worry. This was the first missed morning in 3 months. In 90 days of consistent appearance, the woman had never been absent. The reliability of her arrival had become so absolute that Diane had organized her own mornings around it. She asked the regulars, the ones who came in consistently, the ones who developed their own rituals around Rosewood Diner. Has anyone seen the older woman? The one who always sits in booth 7? Gray hair, comes in around 7:47. Most looked blank. One man, Mr. Patterson, who'd been ordering the same eggs and bacon for 15 years, said he hadn't noticed anyone in particular leaving. There's always someone, he'd said, the particular dismissiveness of people who'd learned not to see the invisible made visible. Diane checked the street outside. She peered through the front windows, scanning the sidewalk for that familiar hunched silhouette. She even stepped outside, her uniform not warm enough against the November chill, and looked both directions down the street. Nothing. The woman had simply vanished. That night, Diane barely slept. She lay in her apartment, under her 3 blankets and winter coat, and felt a specific kind of loss that surprised her with its intensity. This was more than disappointment. This was grief. This was the realization that she'd become more invested in this invisible woman's well-being than she'd consciously acknowledged. What if something had happened to her? What if she was sick? What if she'd fallen? The woman had moved with such deliberate care, each step negotiated with her aging body. How many falls could a body like that survive? Diane found herself constructing worst-case scenarios. The woman hospitalized, alone, with no one checking on her. The woman fallen at home, unable to call for help. The woman simply gone, disappeared into whatever mechanism swallowed elderly, invisible people. By 3 a.m., Diana convinced herself that something terrible had occurred. She reported for her 6:15 a.m. shift the next morning with shadows under her eyes and a knot of anxiety in her chest. She went through the motions automatically. The coffee station, the prep work, the arrival of other customers. But she was watching the clock, watching the door, hoping against logic that 7:47 a.m. would bring that familiar figure pushing through. It didn't. At 8:15 a.m., with no sign of the woman, Diane did something she shouldn't have done. She prepared the breakfast and left it sitting in the kitchen instead of throwing it away. It would spoil. Todd would notice. But Diane couldn't bring herself to discard it. As long as the food remained prepared, there was still a possibility that the woman would arrive. As long as the coffee sat warming, the eggs stayed fresh, the toast remained cut at that precise angle, there was still hope. She didn't understand yet that hope was being redefined entirely. She didn't realize that the absence was part of a larger design, that forces were already in motion, that the woman she'd been serving every morning for 3 months had orchestrated this moment with the precision of a conductor preparing the audience for a crescendo. All Diane knew was the silence. All she felt was the loss of the one ritual that had made her life feel like it contained meaning. The next morning, nothing had changed except everything. Diane arrived at 6:15 a.m., prepped the station, waited. The clock moved towards 7:47. The breakfast was ready by 7:50, warming on the counter. But booth 7 remained empty, and the ache of that emptiness had begun to feel permanent. Then, at 8:15 a.m., the bell above the front door chimed. But this time, it wasn't the woman. For men entered in perfect formation. Not casual, not wandering. They moved like soldiers, like security personnel trained in specific protocols. Each stood well over 6 feet, their shoulders broad beneath tailored dark suits that fit them with expensive precision. They wore identical expressions, focused, neutral, the particular blankness of people trained not to have personalities. They scanned the diner methodically. Their eyes cataloged exits, positions, angles of escape. They assessed the customers with the clinical attention of people trained to identify threats and vulnerabilities. They looked at Todd behind the counter, at the waitresses, at the elderly man reading a newspaper in booth 2. Then they stepped aside. The woman who entered behind them commanded space simply by existing in it. She was tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Diane's monthly rent. Her silver hair was styled with professional precision, swept back from a face that bore the particular architecture of privilege. A woman who'd been constructed through careful attention and considerable expense. She wore jewelry that caught light and held it, a platinum watch, a diamond on her left hand, pearls at her throat that looked like they were weighing her with significance. But what struck Diane most was her posture. This woman had never been invisible. She moved through space with the confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime being seen, being listened to, being obeyed. Authority radiated from her like heat. The entire diner had gone silent. Even the background noise, the clinking of silverware, the low murmur of conversation, the perpetual hum of the coffee station, seemed to pause in deference to her arrival. She walked directly toward the counter where Diane stood frozen, unsure whether to run or hide, or simply accept whatever was happening. "Are you Diane Rose Murphy?" the woman asked. Her voice was calm, measured, unaccented in that particular way of people who'd been educated at institutions that taught precision as a form of power. It wasn't unkind, but it held no warmth either. It was the voice of someone used to asking questions, used to having them answered immediately, used to the world arranging itself according to her preferences. Diane's mouth had gone dry. Her work uniform suddenly felt obscene. The faded fabric, the coffee stains that had accumulated over months, the name tag that identified her as service staff rather than person. "Yes," she managed. "I'm Diane Murphy." "My name is Margaret Ashford," the woman said. "I'm an attorney. I need to speak with you about a matter of significant importance. Is there somewhere private we could talk?" Around them, the diner had become a theater. Crystal and Beth were openly staring. Todd had stepped out from behind the counter, his face suggesting he was running calculations about what this meant for his business. The other customers had abandoned the pretense of eating or reading. They were simply watching, trying to piece together what story this was. Diane felt the weight of all that attention, all that curiosity, all that judgment. She felt how her ordinary morning was being transformed into spectacle, how her invisible life was suddenly becoming visible in the worst possible way. "What is this about?" she asked, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. Margaret's expression didn't change. "It's about Eleanor Hartley, and about a will that makes specific provisions regarding you." The name meant nothing to Diane, but as Margaret said it, as she watched that woman's face for clues, Diane felt something shift in her chest, a recognition, a terrible understanding beginning to form. Eleanor, the woman from booth 7, the woman who'd disappeared. "What's happened to her?" Diane asked urgently. "Is she okay? Is she?" "That's something we need to discuss in private," Margaret said, her tone suggesting that the diner was not appropriate space for conversations of this magnitude. "I've taken the liberty of arranging transportation. If you can take your break, we have significant matters to attend to." Todd appeared at Diane's elbow, his face a mixture of confusion and the particular enthusiasm of someone who'd realized this visitor represented something potentially advantageous. "Of course she can take a break. How long will she need?" Margaret looked at Diane with eyes that had assessed her situation completely. An hour should suffice for the initial conversation. What Diane didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that her entire life was being redefined in that moment, that everything she thought she understood about herself, about Eleanor, about the ritual that had defined her mornings for 3 months, was about to be inverted entirely. All she knew was that she was being summoned. All she understood was that Eleanor had been orchestrating something, and now the design was about to be revealed. Margaret Ashford waited for Diane in a booth near the back, a booth that suddenly felt like neutral territory transformed into something far more official. Two assistants stood nearby, positioned like sentries, holding leather briefcases that suggested documents of consequence. "Please sit," Margaret said, gesturing to the seat across from her. Diane sat. Her uniform suddenly felt like a costume, like a disguise she was wearing to pretend she belonged in spaces where she clearly didn't. "I'm going to be direct," Margaret began, her tone suggesting she was accustomed to delivering information that required processing. 3 days ago, Eleanor Hartley passed away peacefully in her home. She was 91 years old. The words landed like stones. Eleanor was dead. Eleanor, the woman Diane had been serving for 3 months. The woman whose silence had communicated something profound. The woman who'd gripped her wrist with surprising strength. That woman was gone. Diane felt something shift inside her chest, a grief that seemed disproportionate to the actual relationship she'd had with Eleanor. But grief doesn't calculate relationships according to logic. It operates on a deeper principle. The recognition of loss, the understanding that something significant has been removed from the world. "I'm sorry," Diane said, the words sounding inadequate even as she spoke them. Margaret nodded, acknowledging the sentiment without dwelling on it. Eleanor's death was expected. She was elderly, and while she enjoyed good health for her age, she was living on borrowed time, so to speak. Margaret opened one of the leather briefcases and extracted a document, old paper with Eleanor's signature at the bottom. "What may surprise you is that Eleanor's final will contains very specific provisions regarding you." "Me?" Diane's voice was barely a whisper. I barely knew her." "That's where you're incorrect," Margaret said. Her tone wasn't unkind, but it carried the weight of someone correcting a fundamental misunderstanding. "Eleanor knew you extensively. She observed you for exactly 94 days, from the morning she first appeared at Rosewood Diner until the morning she disappeared. During that time, she meticulously documented your behavior, your choices, and your character." Margaret produced another document, this one more recent, typed in legal language. Eleanor was quite specific in her instructions. "To Diane Rose Murphy, the will states, I leave this bequest not as reward for service, but as recognition of authentic human character. The woman who brings her coffee at exactly 7:50 a.m., cut the toast at an angle, and listens to her speak without judgment. The woman who continues to show kindness despite mockery from her coworkers. The woman who maintained her humanity when circumstances conspired to strip it away." Diane felt her eyes filling with tears. Eleanor had noticed. Eleanor had been paying attention not just to the ritual, but to the cost of that ritual, to the fact that Diane continued despite mockery, despite Todd's warnings, despite the grinding exhaustion of her life. "I don't understand," Diane said. "Why was she testing me? Who was Eleanor Hartley?" "That's conversation for later," Margaret said. She pulled out a document that bore the official seal of probate court. "For now, you need to know this. Eleanor's final will contains a binding legal requirement. You must be present for the full reading of her will. This is not optional. This is a condition stipulated in the document itself." Margaret glanced at her watch. Expensive, precise, the watch of someone who measured time as a commodity. "I'll need you to wrap up your shift here. We have a car waiting outside. We'll proceed to my offices in downtown Columbus. The reading is scheduled for 10 a.m. Diane looked around the diner. Todd was watching from behind the counter with barely concealed curiosity. Crystal and Beth were whispering to each other, their eyes tracking this interaction like raptors tracking prey. The other customers had abandoned any pretense of eating. They were simply observing, processing, preparing their own narratives about what this meant. "I'll get my things," Diane said. She moved like someone operating in a dream, retrieving her jacket, punching out at the register. Todd called after her. "Murphy, what's going on? When are you coming back?" She didn't answer. She wasn't sure she had an answer. The black Mercedes waited outside Rosewood Diner like a predator that had identified its prey and was simply confirming the capture. It was gleaming pristine, the kind of vehicle that suggested money spent without negotiation. One of Margaret's assistants opened the back door, and Diane found herself sliding into leather seats that smelled like expensive perfume and polish. The interior of the car was a world unto itself, climate-controlled, perfectly silent. A divider separated the driver from the passengers, creating a space of absolute privacy. On the seat beside Diane was a bottle of water, unopened, chilled to perfect temperature. Everything about the car communicated well through the language of comfort and control. As the car pulled away from Rosewood Diner, Diane watched the establishment recede in the side mirror. That was her world. The red vinyl booths, the burnt coffee smell, the fluorescent lights that made everyone look equally exhausted. And now she was being transported into something else entirely. The drive through Columbus felt surreal. They moved south through the neighborhoods Diane knew, the working-class districts where she'd spent her entire adult life. Then the car began climbing in elevation, literally and metaphorically. The neighborhoods changed. The architecture became more ambitious. The buildings grew taller. Eventually, the car entered downtown Columbus, pulling up to a glass building that seemed to stretch toward the sky with the ambition of something defying gravity. 40 stories of steel and glass and steel again, a monument to the accumulation of capital and power. Floor 40, Margaret said, as if this was information Diane needed to know. Ashford and Associates, my offices. The elevator rose through the building like a vertical journey through stratified wealth. Each floor that passed represented someone's profitable existence, someone's carefully curated success. By the time they reached floor 40, Diane felt untethered from the world she knew. The offices of Ashford and Associates were a study in calculated intimidation. The floors were marble that reflected the city skyline below like a second reality. The walls were glass, allowing panoramic views of Columbus spread beneath them like a kingdom. Diane could see the city from an angle she'd never experienced, reduced, miniaturized, transformed into something manageable. She felt small. She felt like she was being shown something that was never meant for her eyes. She felt like a stray cat that had wandered into a palace and was being tolerated only until it made an inconvenient mess. An assistant led her through corridors of glass and chrome to a boardroom. The walls here were frosted glass, creating privacy while suggesting transparency. The table was massive, black marble, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than everything Diane owned combined. 3 people were already seated at the table. One was Margaret Ashford, who'd composed herself into the form of attorney, all efficiency and professional distance. The other 2 were visibly angry. The man was in his 50s, wearing a suit that had probably been expensive once, but now strained at the buttons, the fabric pulling across a chest that suggested sedentary wealth and stress eating. His face was flushed, his hands clenched on the table. His name was embroidered on a small placard, Thomas Hartley. The woman was younger, perhaps 40, with a kind of appearance that suggested significant financial investment in maintenance. Perfect hair, perfect makeup, perfectly manicured rage. Her placard read, Victoria Hartley. They were looking at Diane the way one might look at a stain that had suddenly appeared on expensive clothing. "This is who we've been waiting for," Thomas said, his voice carrying the particular disdain of someone whose expectations have been shattered. "A waitress? Mother really has lost her mind," Victoria added, her tone suggesting this was confirmation of something she'd long suspected. "I don't understand why this person had to be summoned. She's a stranger. She has nothing to do with Mother's affairs." Margaret's response was delivered with the calm precision of someone who'd anticipated this reaction and was proceeding according to plan. Eleanor's was clear. The reading cannot proceed without Ms. Murphy's presence. This is a binding legal requirement stipulated in the document itself. Thomas and Victoria exchanged glances, angry, confused, resentful. Diane sat at the table, trembling slightly, still in her work uniform, her name tag identifying her as service staff. She felt the weight of their judgment, their confusion, their presumption that she was somehow deceiving them, that she'd somehow manipulated an old woman for personal gain. "Let's proceed," Margaret said, opening her document portfolio. Margaret began reading from Eleanor's will with the formal precision of someone whose words carried legal weight and consequence. "To my son Thomas, I leave $2.3 million. Thomas leaned forward immediately, his jaw unclenched slightly. $2.3 million. Even after taxes, after distributions, it was a significant sum. And my investment portfolio valued at $15 million. on the condition that he completes 5 years of therapy to address his documented entitlement and gambling addiction. Thomas's face flushed crimson. This is ridiculous. She's questioning my judgment. Eleanor left detailed documentation, Margaret said calmly, including records of your gambling debts, the 3 times she paid off your creditors, and the financial advisors who warned her of your spending patterns. The condition stands. 5 years of therapy, documented progress, or the investment portfolio goes to the Hartley Foundation. Thomas stood abruptly, his chair clattering backward. He looked like he might say something else, might argue, might rage, but the legality of the situation seemed to be settling over him. He sat back down, his face dark with anger. To my daughter Victoria, I leave $1.8 million and our family home in Bexley. Victoria smiled, a vindication, a recognition that she was favored, that her mother had trusted her judgment. She was already calculating how she'd decorate, what she'd change, how she'd utilize the property, which you must sell within 2 years, Margaret continued. The proceeds are to go to the Hartley Foundation for Underprivileged Women. The foundation cannot be dissolved. The properties cannot be retained for personal use. Victoria's smile evaporated. What? That's not. Mother wouldn't. Your mother was quite specific, Margaret said. Eleanor believed that generational wealth creates generational entitlement. She wanted to interrupt that cycle in her own family. The room had become a study in disappointment. Thomas was furious. Victoria was confused, trying to process how victory had been transformed into obligation. Then Margaret looked directly at Diane. To Diane Rose Murphy, I leave. The pause stretched like elastic. Diane held her breath. Thomas and Victoria leaned forward, curious despite their anger, wondering what Eleanor had possibly left to this stranger. This waitress who'd appeared in their mother's life and apparently occupied some significant space in her final testament. To Diane Rose Murphy, I leave the property at 847 Riverside Drive, Columbus, Ohio. Thomas and Victoria exchanged glances. Their confusion was palpable. A property that seemed modest, a house, perhaps a modest inheritance that Eleanor had decided to gift to this stranger. It was unusual, certainly, but not catastrophic. Valued at approximately $250,000, Margaret continued. Still modest. Still insufficient to explain the fanfare, the formal summons, the legal requirement that Diane be present for this reading. Thomas leaned back in his chair with visible disgust. She leaves her a house? A single house? His tone suggested that this was not just unusual, but insulting. A waste of Eleanor's considerable estate on someone who'd done nothing to deserve it. Victoria added mockingly, her voice dripping with the particular cruelty of the disappointed. How generous. A waitress's lottery ticket. I'm sure she'll know what to do with it. The words landed like small cuts, designed to wound through dismissal. Then Margaret paused. She looked directly at Diane, then back at the document. The silent stretch became intentional, became a pause that suggested something significant was about to be revealed. Included with the property, Margaret said, her voice dropping slightly in register, gaining weight, is controlling stake in Hartley Enterprises Holdings, currently valued at approximately $47 million. The room froze. Furthermore, Margaret continued, her precision now serving to deliver maximum impact. The property generates $3.2 million annually in passive income through various holdings, investments, and business operations managed by the Hartley Foundation. Thomas stood so violently that his chair didn't just tip, it flew backward, clattering across the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire building. His face had gone from red to a mottled purple. This is insane. This is... Mother was not in her right mind. We need to challenge this. We need psychiatric evaluations, competency reviews. Victoria had gone white. Her perfectly manicured hands were gripping the edge of the table, so hard that her knuckles had turned pale. 47 million? To her? To a waitress? Diane's hands had gone numb. The numbers weren't processing properly in her mind. They were too large, too abstract, too disconnected from any reality she inhabited. $47 million. $3.2 million annually. These figures belonged to other people, people who existed in different tax brackets, different universes. Margaret's voice cut through the chaos with the precision of a scalpel. Eleanor was quite specific about her intentions. The property at 847 Riverside Drive, Hurwell Estates, was meant to serve as a foundation, a place where she could operate quietly, away from corporate scrutiny, away from the performance of generational wealth. Ms. Murphy inherits not just financial assets, but purpose. She inherits the obligation to continue what I could not complete, the creation of a world where invisible people are finally seen. Margaret paused, allowing the weight of those words to settle over the room like snow. Ms. Murphy inherits not just wealth, but legacy. Margaret produced a key. It was ornate, silver, heavy, with significance. The kind of key that suggested it opened something that mattered, something that had been kept deliberately separate and protected. Eleanor left you access to private study, Margaret said, handing the key to Diane with a gesture that felt ceremonial. No one has been inside for 15 years. She was explicit in her instructions. You, and only you, should enter it first, before reviewing any documents, before making any decisions about the estate, before anything else. Go to the study, read what she left for you. Then we'll continue this conversation. Diane took the key. It was surprisingly warm, as if it had been held in someone's hands moments before. The study was on the 39th floor, opposite side of the building. Margaret's assistant escorted Diane to a private elevator, inserted a key card, pressed the button. The elevator rose silently, and then Diane was standing in front of an unmarked door. She inserted the key. It turned smoothly. The door opened. The room felt frozen in time, as if it had been sealed against the world for exactly the 15 years Margaret had mentioned. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes that looked ancient and well-read. A mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, its surface clear except for a single envelope addressed to Diane in elegant cursive. But what caught her attention was the walls. They were covered with photographs and documents arranged in a careful, deliberate pattern. Newspaper clippings, yellowed with age. Personnel files. Strategic notes written in Eleanor's precise handwriting. A corkboard displayed decades of careful planning. Names, dates, financial records. Photographs of people Diane didn't recognize. This wasn't a study. This was a war room. Diane moved to the desk and opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter multiple pages, written in Eleanor's steady hand. She sat down and began to read. By now, you know my name, the letter began. You know I was testing you, but what you don't know is why. What you don't know is what I've spent the last 40 years becoming, and what I hope you'll become in my place. The letter continued, and as Diane read, Eleanor's life unfolded like a map of grief and redemption. Eleanor Hartley had built Hartley Enterprises from nothing. She was the daughter of a factory worker and a schoolteacher, born into circumstances that promised nothing. But she had been brilliant, ruthlessly, strategically, brilliantly intelligent. She'd attended college on scholarship, then business school, then spent 40 years accumulating capital, building networks, constructing an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But 20 years ago, everything had changed. Eleanor's daughter, her only child from a brief marriage that had ended before the girl was old enough to remember her father, had been killed in a car accident. She was 17 years old. Her name was Margaret. She'd been the light of Eleanor's life, the one thing she'd allowed to matter more than the business. The accident wasn't random. The drunk driver who'd hit Margaret's car was a man named Kenneth Russo. He'd been employed by a Hartley Enterprises subsidiary. There had been warnings. Other employees had reported his drinking. Safety audits had flagged his position as potentially problematic. But Eleanor had been too busy building empires to notice. She'd delegated the decision to fire him to middle management, and middle management had decided that Russo was valuable enough to keep, that his productivity outweighed his liability. For 3 months after Margaret's death, Eleanor had descended into a grief so complete that she'd contemplated suicide. She'd stood on the balcony of her penthouse and considered whether there was any reason to continue existing in a world where her daughter no longer did. But something had stopped her. Not hope, exactly, not faith, but a particular kind of rage, a cold, methodical, strategic rage that transformed itself into purpose. She'd spent the next 15 years destroying Kenneth Russo's life. Systematically, legally, carefully. She'd hired investigators. She'd documented his crimes. Yes, there were others. Crimes his previous employers had overlooked. She'd built a legal case. When Russo had died in prison, Eleanor had felt no satisfaction, only the hollow recognition that revenge was not the same as redemption. So she transformed it into something else. She'd purchased a diner in a working-class neighborhood of Columbus, not for profit. The financial returns were negligible, but as an experiment, a laboratory for testing human character. I realized something after Margaret died. The letter read, "The world doesn't need more business executives. It doesn't need more people who've learned to calculate everything in terms of profit and loss. What it needs are people who can see, people who can notice the invisible, people who can show kindness without expectation of reward, who can maintain their humanity when the world is grinding them into smaller and smaller pieces." Eleanor had hired investigators to track the waitresses at Rosewood Diner. She'd documented their behavior systematically. Most of them had failed the test in expected ways. They were kind only when tips were probable. They were dismissive when customers seemed unlikely to spend money. They'd learned to optimize their behavior according to financial incentive. But then Diane had appeared. "For 94 days, I watched you serve me breakfast." Eleanor's letter continued. "I watched you show me kindness despite mockery from your coworkers. I watched you maintain dignity while the world treated you as invisible. I watched you speak about your mother with love, despite the financial burden she represented. I watched you mourn your abandoned dreams without bitterness. And I recognized in you what I'd failed to protect in my daughter, a capacity for authentic human grace." Eleanor had documented it all, the ritual, the precision, the cost. She'd understood exactly what Diane was sacrificing to show her kindness. "I am 91 years old," the letter read. "I am dying. Within months, my body will fail in ways that medicine cannot prevent. But before I die, I want to ensure that what I've learned, what Margaret's death taught me about the value of human character, continues into the world. I want to ensure that kindness matters, that seeing invisible people matters, that maintaining your humanity in a brutal world is not foolish. It is the only thing that matters." Diane turned the page, and there was a photograph. Eleanor, 40 years younger, stood beside a girl who must have been Margaret. The girl was smiling, genuinely, radiantly smiling. The smile of someone who believed the world was fundamentally good. She had Eleanor's intelligence in her eyes, but something softer, something that Eleanor had apparently learned to cultivate after Margaret's death. On the back of the photograph, Eleanor had written in her careful script, "This is Margaret. She had your heart. She had your kindness, your grace, your ability to see people others overlook. I watched you become her, month by month, in that diner. You were my test, and you were also my salvation." Another note was attached, this one typed, formal, final. "I chose you to carry forward what I failed to protect in her. The money is for your freedom. The property is for your heart. This legacy is for your future. Eleanor." Diane sat in that sealed room, holding a photograph of a dead girl, reading the final words of a woman who'd seen her, who'd been testing her, who decided that Diane's capacity for kindness was worth protecting. She wept, not from joy, though there was joy in this inheritance, but from the recognition that she'd been seen, that her small act of sustained kindness had been noticed, that in a world designed to make people invisible, someone had been paying attention all along. The final pages of Eleanor's letter contained instruction, not comfort. They contained a challenge. "You will be tested again," Eleanor had written. "My children will fight. The board of Hartley Enterprises will resist. You'll have to prove you're worthy not just of kindness, but of power. The board will argue that a waitress cannot run a $47 million enterprise. They will cite your lack of experience. They will question your judgment. They will attempt to manipulate you through fear and flattery." Eleanor had included detailed instructions, names of board members who could be trusted, names of those who would resist, strategies for consolidating power while maintaining Eleanor's vision of the company. "Use the money wisely," Eleanor's letter concluded. "Use the business to create what I failed to create. A world where invisible people are finally seen, where kindness is not measured in profit margins, where the smallest act of human grace is recognized as the most valuable investment a person can make. You will be tested, Diane, and I believe you will pass. I believe you already have. The letter was signed simply, Eleanor. Diane sat in that sealed room for a long time, holding the photograph of a dead girl, understanding that her life had been irrevocably altered. She was no longer a waitress drowning in medical debt. She was the inheritor of Eleanor's vision, the carrier of a legacy built on understanding that character mattered more than circumstances. She had been tested, and Eleanor believed she'd passed. Now she had to prove Eleanor right. The first phone call came from Diane's apartment that night, after she'd returned from downtown Columbus in a daze that hadn't quite dissipated. She dialed the number for Bright Meadows Nursing Facility with shaking fingers. When the administrator answered, Diane's voice was different, not hesitant, not apologetic, but clear and certain. I want to pay off my mother's account in full, she said. All past due amounts, plus 2 years in advance. There was a pause. The administrator clearly didn't know how to process this request. Ms. Murphy, that's your balance, is approximately $115,000. Are you certain? I'm certain, Diane said. And I want to move her to your suite, whatever makes her most comfortable. She'd spent her entire adult life apologizing for her poverty, for her inability to afford better care, for the ways financial circumstance limited what she could provide her mother. She wouldn't apologize anymore. The second call was to her landlord. This time, Diane wasn't requesting. She was informing. I'm buying the building, she said. I'll have my attorney contact you with the offer tomorrow morning. The current tenant's rent is frozen at current rates for 5 years. You can accept the offer, or I'll find another building. The landlord tried to negotiate. Diane hung up. The third call was to the medical collection company. She requested a full accounting of her mother's medical debt. When they provided a number, $47,000 across various hospitals and specialists, Diane arranged an immediate wire transfer. She sat on her apartment floor after that, under her 3 blankets and winter coat, and she wept. Not gentle tears, but deep, body-shaking sobs that came from somewhere beneath consciousness. For years, she'd been carrying the weight of these numbers, medical bills, collection agencies, the grinding fear that she wasn't enough to keep her mother safe. And now, in a single day, that weight had simply lifted. The panic that had been constant, a living, breathing monster that lived in her chest, suddenly had no more oxygen. It dissipated like smoke. For the first time in years, Diane could breathe without the sensation of drowning. Diane returned to Rosewood Diner on a Monday morning, 5 days after Eleanor's will had been read. She arrived at 10 a.m., wearing clothes that weren't her work uniform, a professional blazer over a simple shirt, the first new clothing she'd purchased in 2 years. Todd was behind the counter when she walked in. His face went pale as he recognized her. He was already calculating, already assessing whether this appearance represented a problem or an opportunity. I own this place now, Diane said simply. She set down the property deed on the counter. The diner had been part of Eleanor's holdings, part of the $47 million holdings, part of the legacy. The color drained further from Todd's face. What? Ms. Murphy, I don't understand. You don't need to, Diane said. Her voice was steady, clear. The voice of someone who'd been given permission to reclaim her own authority. What you need to understand is that things are changing. I'm calling a staff meeting. 30 minutes. Break room. She turned to address the handful of customers scattered throughout the diner. We're closing for 1 hour. Thank you for understanding. When Todd started to protest, Diane simply looked at him. Something in her expression, a particular certainty, made him stop. The staff meeting happened exactly 30 minutes later. Crystal and Beth arrived confused, suspicious, defensive. Todd looked like he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. 2 prep cooks stood in the back, unsure why they'd been summoned. I want to announce some changes, Diane began. She'd spent the morning organizing her thoughts, planning this carefully. Effective immediately, every employee of Rosewood Diner receives a 40% raise. The room erupted. Crystal's eyes went wide. Beth's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. One of the prep cooks let out a small laugh, as if this was some kind of joke. Second, Diane continued, we're implementing actual benefits. health insurance, dental coverage, vision care, retirement matching at 3% of salary. Third, we're closing 1 day per week every Monday, so staff can rest without losing pay. Todd's face had gone from pale to flushed. Ms. Murphy, that's insane. The profit margins will no longer be your concern, Diane said. Her tone was not unkind, but it was absolute. You're fired, effective immediately. You can collect severance from HR on your way out. You'll receive 2 months' pay plus accrued vacation. Todd started to respond, then seemed to realize that arguing was futile. He stood, his expression a mixture of shock and rage, and walked out without another word. For the rest of you, Diane said, addressing the remaining staff, I want you to understand something. You're not just employees. You're the foundation of this place. Everything that happens here, every customer who walks through that door and feels seen, feels welcomed, feels like they matter. That happens because of you. She paused, making sure they understood. Eleanor Hartley, the woman who died last week, she left this diner in her will. She left it to me. And she left it to me because she believed that kindness matters, that seeing invisible people matters. I'm going to run this place according to that principle. Crystal approached her after the meeting ended. There was something different in her expression, less hardened, more vulnerable, as if she'd been given permission to access emotions she'd learned to suppress. We're sorry, Crystal said, for not seeing what you saw, for mocking you for caring. We'd learned not to. Diane understood. She'd learned not to care too. That's what survival demanded. That's what the world insisted on in exchange for keeping your head above water. No apologies necessary, Diane said. You're being given permission to care again. That's all Eleanor was asking for. That's all I'm asking for. 2 weeks into her ownership of Rosewood Diner, the kitchen equipment catastrophically failed. The main oven, ancient, temperamental, held together through decades of improvisation, simply stopped working. Then the walk-in cooler's compressor died. Within hours, the kitchen that had functioned as the diner's heart had become a liability. The old owner would have closed for days, would have called a repair company and waited for the parts to arrive, would have prioritized keeping the doors closed over keeping customers served. Diane made a different calculation. We're calling it in, she told Marcus, the head prep cook, the man who'd worked at Rosewood for 7 years and had somehow maintained his humanity through it all. Full replacement. Top of the line. And we don't close, we operate from a back kitchen while it's being installed. That's going to cost, Marcus began. I don't care what it costs, Diane said. We serve 200 people a day. They depend on us. We're not letting them down. Equipment arrived within 48 hours. The installation took 3 days, during which Diane was on her feet alongside her staff, helping move supplies, reorganizing workflows, solving problems in real time. She got flour in her hair and grease on her clothes. She burned her fingers on a pot of broth. She learned the geometry of the kitchen's functionality from people who'd spent years understanding it. One evening, as the installation neared completion, Marcus approached her. He was a man in his 50s, weathered by life, bearing the particular exhaustion of someone who'd given up expecting the world to be kind. I've been working here for 7 years, he said. I've had managers. I've had owners, and not a single one has ever cared like you do. Not a single one has ever invested in a place like you're investing. Thank you. Diane realized something in that moment. Eleanor's legacy wasn't about the money. It was about creating a world where people like Marcus felt valued, where invisibility could be interrupted, where work felt like participation in something that mattered rather than just extraction of labor. 3 weeks after taking over Rosewood Diner, Diane faced her real test of leadership. Mr. Chun, a regular who'd been coming to the diner for 15 years, collapsed in booth 3 during the morning rush. His heart, that's what the paramedics told her while they were working on him, while they were moving him onto a gurney, while they were rushing him toward whatever emergency room could save his life or couldn't. Diane rode with him in the ambulance. She sat with him in the hospital waiting room while doctors assessed the damage. She called his son, whom she found listed in his wallet, whom she'd never met, but who answered the phone with the particular dread of someone receiving bad news about aging parents. Mr. Chun survived. The heart attack was severe but not fatal. The doctor said he'd been fortunate. A few more minutes of delay and the outcome would have been different. When he'd recovered enough to have visitors, Diane returned to the hospital. She brought him soup from Rosewood Diner. Not hospital food, not something generic, but the specific soup Mr. Chin loved. The one she'd learned to prepare exactly the way he liked it. Your meals are free for 1 year, she told him. And I'm connecting you with our community resources. You shouldn't be eating alone. We're going to find you support, find you people who check on you, find you ways to not be invisible anymore. Mr. Chin wept. He was a man who'd spent 15 years in a city of 500,000 people and had never been truly seen. Now, the moment when his mortality had become visceral and real, he was being offered the simple grace of being noticed. The story spread through Columbus's working-class neighborhoods with the speed of genuine kindness. The woman who owned Rosewood Diner didn't just serve food. She served people. She noticed them. She saw them. She invested in their well-being. Business increased 35% within a month. Not from marketing, not from advertising, but from word of mouth, from people telling the story of being seen, from regulars bringing friends and family to experience what it felt like to matter. Diane had proven something essential, that you could maintain your humanity even while wielding power, that seeing people wasn't weakness. It was the foundation of genuine leadership. Eleanor would have been proud. Thomas Hartley, enraged by the will's provisions, hired the most aggressive lawyers Columbus could provide. His strategy was calculated and ruthless. Challenge Eleanor's mental competency at the time the will was written. Argue that she'd been suffering from dementia, from diminished capacity, from the particular cognitive decline that came with advanced age. If he could prove Eleanor was mentally unfit when she drafted the will, the entire document could be voided. The estate would be redistributed according to intestate succession. Eleanor's specific provisions, the conditions placed on his and Victoria's inheritance, the substantial bequest to this stranger, would all become irrelevant. His lawyers filed the competency challenge 3 weeks after the will was read. The suit was designed to do more than invalidate Eleanor's will. It was designed to freeze Diane's assets while the legal proceedings unfolded. If Diane's inheritance was frozen, if she couldn't access the money or the business holdings, she'd be forced to hire lawyers to defend herself. The legal fees alone would be devastating. And if the case dragged on for years, if Thomas could bury Diane under an avalanche of depositions and discovery requests and motions, he could exhaust her into surrender. His second strategy was corporate sabotage. Thomas had spent decades working in Hartley Enterprises. He had relationships with board members, particularly the older ones who'd profited handsomely from ruthless business practices. He began organizing, making phone calls, consolidating support. His message was consistent. We don't need a Waitress running a $400 million company. Let's restore professional management. Several board members responded positively. They proposed a motion for exactly 30 days away. Vote Diane out as trustee. Restore the board's traditional authority. Distribute the assets among Eleanor's family according to a more conventional structure. Thomas's calculation was sound. Diane had no business experience. She had no education in corporate finance. She was an outsider, a stranger, someone who'd infiltrated Eleanor's life and now was reaping the rewards of her infiltration. From certain perspectives, Thomas's challenge seemed justified. He was willing to burn Hartley Enterprises to the ground rather than accept Diane as its steward. Diane met with Margaret Ashford, the attorney, in an office that had become increasingly familiar to her over the past month. Thomas is serious, Margaret said, her tone suggesting she'd anticipated this development. He'll pursue this as far as legally possible. The competency challenge could take years to resolve. In the meantime, your assets will be frozen. The board motion is scheduled for 30 days. They have the votes to pass it. Diane felt the weight of these competing pressures. She could hire lawyers, but the legal fees would be astronomical. She could try to convince board members to maintain confidence, but she had no track record in corporate environments, no history of successful business decisions they could point to. What are my options? Diane asked. Legally, you're in a stronger position than you might think, Margaret said. Eleanor's will is ironclad. She had mental competency evaluations done the day before she died, comprehensive neuropsychological assessments that documented her complete cognitive fitness. We have documentation of her strategic thinking over decades. We have evidence that her decisions were rational and deliberately constructed. Margaret leaned forward. But the legal battle will be expensive, and more importantly, it will be public. Thomas will argue his case in court, in media, in social spaces. He'll paint you as a fortune hunter who exploited an elderly woman. He'll question your motives, your character, your worthiness for this inheritance. Diane understood. In court of public opinion, Thomas's narrative was compelling. A waitress inherits $47 million from a stranger? It sounded like either fraud or exploitation or some combination thereof. You can't win this with money or legal strategy, Margaret said. You can only win this with truth. That night, Diane sat in her apartment, no longer cramped and cold, but transformed through renovation that honored Eleanor's legacy, and made a decision. She would go public. She would gather Eleanor's files, the photographs, the documentation of Eleanor's life and transformation. She would tell the story of Eleanor's daughter, of Margaret, of how grief and redemption had intersected. She would reveal Eleanor's decades-long experiment at Rosewood Diner, her deliberate search for character rather than competence. She would expose the truth. If she lost the corporate battle, if the board voted her out, if Thomas succeeded in his competency challenge, at least the story would be known. At least Eleanor's vision would be documented. At least people would understand that what Eleanor had left to Diane wasn't wealth, but purpose. The board meeting was held at the Columbus Convention Center. High profile, public, designed for maximum impact. Thomas had invited media, had orchestrated press coverage, had created an event that would generate headlines. He'd anticipated that Diane would arrive nervous, uncertain, defensive. What he didn't anticipate was that she would arrive transformed. Diane wore a suit that Eleanor's tailor had constructed for her. Professional, elegant, expensive, but not ostentatious. Her hair was styled with care. Her posture communicated authority not through aggression, but through certainty. She was flanked by Margaret, the attorney, and 3 other women, all former employees of Hartley Enterprises. All women whom Eleanor had quietly supported over decades. All women whose careers had been threatened by Thomas's ruthlessness. Thomas's face registered confusion. This wasn't the nervous waitress he'd expected. This was someone who understood that she'd been tested by Eleanor and had passed. Someone who'd accepted the responsibility of Eleanor's legacy. The board chair called for the vote. Before it happened, Diane requested the floor. Diane walked to the center of the room with a clarity that surprised everyone present, including herself. "My name is Diane Murphy," she began. 6 months ago, I was a waitress earning $14 an hour, drowning in medical debt, invisible to everyone, including myself. Eleanor Hartley saw me, and she taught me something about character. Part 1, the simple story. She told them about Rosewood Diner, about the ritual, about 3 months of showing kindness to someone the world had decided didn't matter. She told them about the mockery from coworkers, about Todd's warnings, about the grinding exhaustion of maintaining her humanity in a world that didn't reward it. "I didn't do it for money," she said. "I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because Eleanor Hartley was invisible. I knew what it felt like to be invisible." The room grew quiet. Even Thomas's supporters seemed to be listening. Part 2, the reframe. Eleanor wasn't looking for business acumen, Diane continued. She was looking for character. She was testing me the same way life had tested her. Can you see people others overlook? Can you show kindness without expectation of reward? Can you maintain your humanity when the world expects ruthlessness? She paused, making sure they understood the stakes of the question. Eleanor believed that generational wealth creates generational entitlement. She believed that the greatest threat to business is not external competition, but internal corruption. The belief that profits matter more than people, that money is more important than character. Part 3, the evidence. Diane produced documents. She showed Eleanor's files, the photographs, the evidence of Eleanor's strategic thinking over decades. She showed videos of employees Eleanor had supported, women whose careers Thomas's ruthlessness had nearly destroyed, women who'd been saved by Eleanor's quiet intervention. She showed financial records of Thomas's gambling debts, documented evidence of his mismanagement, proof that Eleanor had paid off his creditors multiple times while he continued the same destructive patterns. Eleanor gave Thomas $15 million on the condition that he complete 5 years of therapy, Diane said. Not to punish him, to save him, because she understood that wealth without transformation becomes poison. Part 4. The alternative. I'm not here to take Eleanor's place, Diane said. I'm here to continue her work. I'm establishing the Eleanor Hartley Foundation. Every employee of this company will receive profit sharing. Every decision will prioritize people over profit. We will rebuild this company on the principle that human character is the only investment that matters. She looked directly at the board members, at the cameras, at Thomas. The question isn't whether I'm qualified to run this company. The question is whether this company is qualified to continue as it has been, whether we are willing to be transformed. She paused, and in that pause, something shifted in the room. Any executive unwilling to commit to that vision is welcome to resign. I won't fire you. I won't challenge you. But I will not compromise on Eleanor's core principle. Invisible people deserve to be seen. The room erupted in applause. It started with the oldest board member, a 78-year-old woman named Patricia, who'd worked in corporate environments her entire life, who'd spent decades watching power corrupt and privilege calcify, and then spread. Patricia stood first. Then others followed. One of Thomas's supporters, a man who'd profited handsomely from brutal business practices, stood and applauded, tears running down his face. Thomas stood abruptly and walked out, his lawyers scrambling behind him. The vote, when called, was 14-2 in Diane's favor, with one abstention from someone who left the room immediately after. The news outlets exploded with the story. Billionaire tests Waitress in secret experiment, leaves $47 million fortune. But the narrative Diane had controlled, the true narrative of Eleanor's vision, of character matching more than circumstances, of invisible people deserving to be seen, was winning. It was spreading. It was transforming how people understood wealth, power, and human dignity. Thomas's competency challenge was withdrawn a week later. His lawyers recognized that public opinion had shifted too dramatically. Pursuing the case would only extend the humiliation. Eleanor's will stood. Eleanor's vision would be implemented. The most significant investment in a person had proven more powerful than any legal strategy. Diane renovated the property at 847 Riverside Drive with meticulous care. She preserved the original 1970s architecture, the bones of Eleanor's hidden kingdom, but updated systems, improved functionality, created spaces that honored both Eleanor's legacy and Diane's vision. She created a memorial space, Eleanor's study, preserved exactly as it had been when Diane first entered it. The photographs, the documents, the corkboard mapping decades of strategic thinking, all of it remained. A museum to Eleanor's transformation from ruthless businesswoman to architect of human dignity. A plaque was mounted on the door, in memory of Eleanor Hartley. She believed invisible people deserved to be seen. Rosewood Diner expanded. The building next door was purchased and converted into a community center, a space where people from the neighborhood could gather, could access resources, could experience the particular grace of being welcomed into community. Employees at Hartley Enterprises received their first profit-sharing checks. The lowest-paid workers received proportionally more, a deliberate inversion of traditional corporate compensation structures. The average employee check was $15,000. For some, it represented the first savings they'd accumulated in years. For others, it meant finally being able to afford health care, to invest in education, to breathe with just slightly less desperation. Crystal and Beth, who'd mocked Diane's kindness, now worked management positions at expanded operations. They approached her months later, not to thank her, but to acknowledge something larger. "We're sorry for not seeing what you saw," Crystal said. Eleanor was right. Character doesn't matter. "We're sorry for choosing cynicism," Beth added. Diane understood. They'd all chosen cynicism at different times, had learned that survival demanded hardening your heart. Eleanor had simply decided to create a world where that hardening was no longer necessary. Diane finally enrolled in the teaching program she'd abandoned 20 years earlier. She took evening classes while managing Hartley Enterprises during the day, a schedule that was exhausting but purposeful in ways her previous survival had never been. Her mother attended one of her community talks, held at the center next to Rosewood Diner. Margaret Murphy, whose mind had been fragmenting into Alzheimer's, managed to focus for those moments. Her daughter stood before a gathered crowd and spoke about kindness, about seeing invisible people, about the transformative power of being noticed. Margaret Murphy smiled, not from medication, but from genuine pride. Her daughter had transcended the circumstances that had imprisoned her. For the first time in decades, Diane balanced her old world with her new one. She still worked at Rosewood some mornings, still served coffee to regulars, still performed the ritual that had started everything. She'd proven that you could maintain humanity even while wielding significant power, that ascending to positions of authority didn't require abandoning the principles that had carried you there. She'd proven something Eleanor had always believed, that the people who've known invisibility make the best custodians of visibility, that those who've struggled understand the difference it makes to be seen. Diane stood before a group of Hartley Enterprises employees, people from every level of the organization, and asked them the question Eleanor had asked her. Who are the invisible people in your own lives? The ones you walk past daily? The ones the world has decided don't matter? What if someone is watching right now, cataloging your kindness? What if you're being tested? The room was silent. Eleanor spent millions building empires. She accumulated $400 million through ruthless business acumen. But the investment she was most proud of wasn't in money. It was in believing the human character. Small acts of sustained kindness, showing people they matter, is worth more than any fortune. Diane paused, making sure they understood. The question isn't whether you'd pass Eleanor's test. The question is, what test are you creating for the people around you? Are you someone who helps invisible people become visible? Are you someone whose kindness might be observed and rewarded by forces you don't yet understand? She looked out at the faces, some crying, some thoughtful, some transformed by the recognition that they might be more than their circumstances suggested. Because somewhere right now, someone is watching. Someone is cataloging your small acts of kindness. Someone is wondering if your character matches your circumstances. And you won't know about it until the moment arrives when you're summoned. Until the moment arrives when all that invisible kindness is suddenly revealed to matter more than you ever imagined. The video would end here. The questions would remain unanswered, not because the story was incomplete, but because the most important questions were always left for viewers to contemplate. Like this video, if Eleanor's story resonated with you, if it made you think about the invisible people in your life, if it made you question what kindness, when no one is watching, really means, comment below. Who in your life deserves to be seen? Tell us about someone you've overlooked. Tell us about someone invisible who mattered more than you recognized. Subscribe so you don't miss the stories that remind us what human character actually looks like when it's tested. Because these stories aren't just entertainment. They're invitations. They're challenges. They're asking you, what would you do? Who would you become if someone was watching? Share this with someone who needs to remember that kindness matters. That visibility is a gift we can give each other. That the smallest acts, performed without expectation of reward, might be the most valuable investments we ever make. Because somewhere someone is watching. Are you someone worth watching?